We must be willing to let go of the life we planned so as to have the life that is waiting for us. There comes a moment in every life when the person you have been can no longer contain the person you are becoming. The walls you build for protection become a prison. The identity you constructed for survival becomes a cage. The beliefs that once gave meaning now suffocate. In this moment, you face a choice that will define the rest of your existence. Cling to the familiar and slowly die inside, or surrender to the terrifying process of transformation. Transformation is perhaps the most paradoxical of all psychological processes. We must die to who we are in order to become who we might be. It demands that we abandon the familiar shores of our current identity and venture into unknown waters, not knowing if we will find land or drown in the depths. Yet without this willingness to dissolve and reform, we remain forever trapped in the prison of who we have always been, mistaking our limitations for our essence. The caterpillar does not become a better caterpillar. It does not attend self-improvement seminars or read books on positive thinking. It dissolves completely into primordial soup, every cell breaking down, every structure liquefying, until nothing remains of what it was. Only then, in this total dissolution, can it reorganize itself into something entirely other, not an improved version of its former self, but a fundamentally different being with wings to fly. This is the pattern that governs all genuine transformation. Not improvement, but metamorphosis. Not addition, but death and rebirth. The word transformation derives from the Latin transformare, meaning to change in shape or form. But psychological transformation is not merely change, it is metamorphosis, the complete restructuring of the self at its deepest levels. We change our clothes, our hairstyle, our job, our city, but transformation changes what we are at the level of being itself. It is not what we do, but who we are that undergoes fundamental reorganization. Ancient wisdom traditions understood what modern psychology is only beginning to rediscover, that the self is not a fixed entity but a fluid process, capable of radical reformation. The alchemists spoke of the magnum opus, the great work of transforming base metal into gold, but this was never truly about chemistry. It was a symbolic language for the transformation of the personality, the refinement of consciousness itself. What appears as lead, the dense, heavy, unconscious aspects of ourselves, contains within it the potential for gold, the realized self in its fullness. In Hindu philosophy, the concept of samsara describes the cycle of death and rebirth, not merely after physical death, but as a continuous process occurring within this life. Each moment offers the possibility of dying to old patterns and being reborn into new ways of being. The snake sheds its skin not once but repeatedly throughout its life, each shedding a small death that allows for growth. We too must learn this art of periodic self-shedding, releasing what no longer serves so that what seeks to emerge can find space to grow. Buddhism teaches that clinging to a fixed sense of self is the root of suffering. The doctrine of anatta, or non-self, reveals that what we call the self is actually an ever-changing constellation of physical and mental phenomena, with no permanent essence. To resist change is to resist reality itself. Transformation becomes possible precisely when we stop defending a rigid self-concept and allow ourselves to flow with the natural processes of growth and decay that govern all living things. Carl Jung dedicated much of his work to understanding the process he called individuation, the psychological journey toward wholeness. This is not about becoming perfect or eliminating our flaws, but rather about integrating all aspects of ourselves, light and shadow, conscious and unconscious, masculine and feminine, into a more complete whole. Jung wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But this requires confronting everything we have rejected about ourselves, retrieving the lost fragments of our being from the darkness where we banished them. The shadow, in Jungian psychology, contains all the qualities we have deemed unacceptable and projected onto others or repressed into unconsciousness. It is the repository of our unlived life, the roads not taken, the selves we might have been but chose to deny. Transformation requires descent into this shadow realm, facing what we have refused to face, acknowledging what we have refused to acknowledge. Only by making the unconscious conscious can we break free from its compulsive grip and choose who we wish to become, rather than being lived by forces we do not understand. This confrontation with the shadow is perhaps the most difficult aspect of transformation. It means seeing ourselves as we actually are, not as we wish to be or pretend to be. It means admitting to the selfishness we have hidden behind apparent generosity, the cowardice beneath our bravado, the cruelty masked by our niceness. As Jung observed, there is no coming to consciousness without pain. We must be willing to shatter our idealized self-image and see the stranger that lives behind our familiar face. Yet the shadow is not only darkness. Within it lies tremendous energy and vitality, all the power we have disowned in order to be acceptable. The person who discovers they have a fierce anger they have never acknowledged gains access to the strength needed to set boundaries and protect what matters. The one who finds the wild, irrational parts they have suppressed may discover creativity and spontaneity they never knew they possessed. The shadow is not the enemy of transformation, but its raw material, the prima materia that must be retrieved and integrated. Transformation also requires what the mystics call the dark night of the soul, periods of profound disorientation and suffering in which everything we have relied upon for meaning and identity fails us. These are not obstacles to transformation, but essential phases within it. The old self must completely break down before the new self can emerge. We must pass through the crucible of dissolution, experiencing the death of who we have been without yet knowing who we will become. This is the most terrifying part of the journey, for we are suspended between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. The mystic poet Rumi wrote, "The wound is the place where the light enters you." Transformation often begins not with strength, but with woundedness, with a shattering of our defenses, with failure and breakdown that force us to question everything we thought we knew. Illness, loss, betrayal, failure, these experiences that feel like endings are often actually beginnings, the necessary destruction that precedes creation. When life strips away everything we have built, we discover what remains, what is essential, what cannot be taken from us. But transformation is not only thrust upon us by circumstances, it can also be chosen. We can deliberately engage in practices that facilitate psychological death and rebirth. Meditation, therapy, artistic creation, spiritual practice. These are technologies of transformation, methods for working consciously with the forces that shape us. The person who enters therapy is saying, in effect, I am willing to die to who I have been in order to discover who I might become. This requires tremendous courage, for we must give up the certainty of our neurosis for the uncertainty of health. Viktor Frankl, who survived the Nazi concentration camps, discovered that transformation often happens through the search for meaning. In his book, Man's Search for Meaning, he describes how those who found purpose, even in the most horrific circumstances, were most likely to survive and emerge transformed rather than broken. Suffering, he realized, is unavoidable, but we can choose how we relate to it. We can let it destroy us, or we can let it transform us into something stronger and more compassionate. Between stimulus and response, there is a space, and in that space lies our power to choose our response. This choice is the seed of transformation. The existentialists understood that we are condemned to freedom, that we must create ourselves through our choices, even though no authority tells us what to choose. This is both terrifying and liberating. We are not predetermined, not fixed, not limited to being what we have always been. Sartre declared that existence precedes essence. We exist first, and only through our choices do we create what we are. Each moment offers the possibility of choosing differently, of becoming other than we have been. But this freedom comes with the weight of responsibility. We cannot blame our past, our parents, our circumstances for who we are. We must take ownership of our becoming. Transformation requires what might be called radical honesty. the willingness to see and speak the truth about ourselves even when it is uncomfortable or unflattering. We lie to ourselves constantly, maintaining elaborate fictions about who we are and why we do what we do. These lies protect us from anxiety, but also imprison us in false selves. To transform, we must become ruthlessly honest, willing to see our self-deceptions, our rationalizations, our carefully constructed narratives that keep us comfortable but stagnant. The philosopher Nietzsche proclaimed that one must have chaos within to give birth to a dancing star. Transformation is inherently chaotic, a period of disorder that precedes new order. We must be willing to endure this chaos, to resist the temptation to prematurely impose structure or return to familiar patterns simply because the uncertainty is unbearable. Like the caterpillar in the chrysalis, we must trust the process of dissolution, knowing that what appears as formless chaos is actually the material of our reformation. Yet transformation is not a solitary journey. We are deeply relational beings, and we transform in relationship with others. The psychoanalyst D.W. Winnicott wrote that there is no such thing as a baby, meaning that an infant cannot exist alone but only in relationship with a caregiver. Similarly, there is no transformation that occurs in complete isolation. We need witnesses to our becoming, people who can see us more clearly than we see ourselves, who can hold space for our emergence when we are most vulnerable. Therapy provides such a relationship, a sacred space where one can explore and experiment with different ways of being under the gaze of another who is trained to facilitate transformation. The therapeutic relationship itself becomes a laboratory for change, a safe container in which old patterns can be examined and new patterns rehearsed. But transformation can also happen in friendship, in love, in any relationship characterized by authenticity, acceptance, and the willingness to grow together. The concept of the wounded healer reminds us that those who have undergone their own transformation are best equipped to guide others through theirs. The therapist who has never faced their own shadow cannot help others face theirs. The teacher who has not walked through their own darkness cannot illuminate the path for students. Our wounds, when worked through and integrated, become our wisdom. Our breakdowns, when survived and understood, become our breakthrough. This is why many spiritual traditions require that teachers undergo initiation, a transformative ordeal that qualifies them to guide others. Transformation often involves what Jung called the transcendent function, the psyche's ability to unite opposites and create something new from their synthesis. We carry within us contradictory impulses, conflicting desires, incompatible parts. The immature psyche tries to eliminate one side of the conflict, declaring one part good and the other bad. But genuine transformation comes through holding the tension of opposites until a third thing emerges, something that transcends and includes both poles. The person torn between independence and connection discovers interdependence. The one split between thinking and feeling develops wisdom. The self divided against itself becomes whole through integration, not elimination. This process requires what the alchemists called the conjunctio, the sacred marriage of opposites within the psyche. Masculine and feminine, conscious and unconscious, spirit and matter, light and dark, these are not enemies to be conquered, but partners to be united. When we stop waging war against parts of ourselves and instead bring them into relationship, transformation becomes possible. The energy previously spent on internal conflict becomes available for growth and creativity. But transformation is not a linear process with a clear beginning, middle, and end. It is spiral, cyclical, a continuous death and rebirth. We do not transform once and remain transformed forever. Life continually presents us with new challenges that require new deaths and new births. The self we became adequate for one stage of life becomes inadequate for the next. The identity that served us in our 20s may need to die in our 40s. The beliefs that gave meaning at one time may need to be released when they no longer fit our expanded understanding. This is why the ancient mystery religions structured their teachings around initiations, ritual deaths, and rebirths that marked transitions from one stage of consciousness to another. The initiate would symbolically die to their old identity and be reborn into a new one, often taking a new name to mark the transformation. Modern secular culture has largely lost these rituals, leaving individuals to navigate major life transitions without guidance or recognition. Yet the need for conscious transformation remains, and we must create our own rituals, our own ways of marking endings and beginnings. The artist understands transformation intimately, for every creative act is a small death and rebirth. The blank canvas, the empty page, these are voids that must be entered, chaotic potential that must be given form. The artist learns to tolerate uncertainty, to work with materials that resist intention, to let go of controlling the outcome, and instead collaborate with forces larger than the ego. This is a profound lesson for anyone undertaking psychological transformation. We cannot control the process. We can only participate in it with as much consciousness and courage as we can muster. Nature provides endless metaphors for transformation. The seed must be buried in darkness and break open before the plant can grow. The forest must sometimes burn for new growth to emerge. Winter's death precedes spring's resurrection. These are not merely poetic images, but actual patterns that govern all living systems, including the human psyche. We are nature, and transformation is our nature. To resist it is to resist life itself. Yet, modern culture often encourages us to resist transformation, to cling to youth, to remain the same, to find our identity and defend it against all change. We are sold products and ideologies that promise to keep us fixed, stable, unchanging. This is a kind of death, the death that comes from refusing to die. The only way to truly live is to die repeatedly, to shed the skins that no longer fit, to release the identities that have become too small for the self that is trying to emerge. Transformation demands sacrifice. The word sacrifice comes from the Latin sacrificer, to make sacred. We must sacrifice what is no longer sacred, what has become an obstacle rather than a support. This might mean sacrificing relationships that keep us small, careers that drain our life force, beliefs that limit our growth, habits that numb us to reality. Each sacrifice is painful because we are attached to what we must release, even when it harms us. But there is a profound difference between sacrifice and self-abandonment. True sacrifice is undertaken freely, in service of becoming, not imposed by others' demands. The archetype of the phoenix rising from its own ashes captures the essence of transformation, voluntary self-immolation followed by rebirth. The phoenix does not accidentally catch fire. It builds its own funeral pyre and ignites it. This is active transformation, chosen destruction in service of renewal. We too must sometimes burn down what we have built in order to build anew. The career, the relationship, the belief system that once gave life may become the very thing that prevents further growth. Recognizing this and having the courage to let it burn is the mark of psychological maturity. But transformation is not about becoming someone else. It is about becoming more fully oneself. The acorn does not transform into an oak by becoming something foreign to its nature, but by actualizing the oak that was always potential within it. Similarly, our transformation is not about adopting an external ideal, but about actualizing our unique potential, becoming the person we were always meant to be beneath the layers of conditioning and adaptation. Jung called this the self with a capital S, the totality of who we are, both conscious and unconscious, actual and potential. The ego, our conscious sense of I, is only a small part of this larger self. Transformation involves the ego learning to serve the self, rather than defending itself against it. This requires a kind of death of the ego, not its elimination but its relativization, the recognition that it is not the center of the psyche but rather a servant of something larger and wiser. This is profoundly threatening to the ego, which experiences any diminishment of its centrality as annihilation. Yet, paradoxically, the ego becomes stronger when it stops trying to control everything and instead aligns itself with the deeper intelligence of the self. The ego that tries to transform through willpower alone inevitably fails because it is trying to lift itself by its own bootstraps. Real transformation happens when the ego surrenders to a process larger than itself, when it stops managing and starts participating. Prayer and meditation can be understood as technologies for this kind of surrender, ways of consciously relinquishing ego control and opening to something beyond the personal self. Whether we call this the self, God, the Tao, or simply the mystery of existence, the act of surrender is the same. We acknowledge our limitations, our not knowing, our need for help from sources beyond our conscious control. This is not weakness but wisdom, the recognition that we are not self-created and self-sustaining but part of larger wholes that exceed our comprehension. Transformation often requires a descent before an ascent, a journey into the underworld before we can rise into new life. This pattern appears in myths worldwide. Inanna descending to the underworld, Persephone abducted to Hades, Jesus dying before resurrection. These are not just stories but maps of the psychological journey we must undertake. We must face our own death, literal or symbolic, before we can be reborn. We must lose ourselves before we can find ourselves. But transformation need not always be dramatic. Sometimes it happens quietly, through small daily choices to live more authentically, to face rather than avoid, to speak truth rather than maintain comfortable lies. The person who chooses honesty over people-pleasing, even in small matters, is transforming. The one who sits with difficult emotions rather than distracting from them is transforming. Transformation is built on countless small deaths of the false self and births of the true self, accumulating over time into profound change. The final paradox of transformation is that we cannot transform ourselves. We can only create conditions in which transformation can occur. We cannot force the caterpillar to become a butterfly, but we can provide the environment in which metamorphosis naturally unfolds. Similarly, we cannot will ourselves into being different people, but we can remove obstacles to our natural unfolding. We can stop reinforcing old patterns. We can choose experiences that challenge and stretch us. This requires patience, for transformation operates on its own timeline, which is often slower than we would prefer. We live in a culture of instant gratification, expecting change to happen quickly and easily. But psychological transformation is more like the growth of a tree than the construction of a building. It cannot be rushed. It requires seasons of growth and seasons of dormancy, times of visible progress, and times when nothing seems to be happening but crucial work is occurring beneath the surface. Yet we must also remember that transformation is not a destination, but a process without end. We do not arrive at a final transformed state and remain there forever. We are always in the midst of transformation, always dying to what was and being born into what is becoming. This is not a burden but a gift, the gift of perpetual possibility, the knowledge that we are never trapped in who we have been, that each moment offers the chance to choose differently, to be differently. The question is not whether we will transform, we will, for change is inevitable, but whether we will transform consciously or unconsciously, willingly or unwillingly, in service of growth or in service of fear. Will we participate in our becoming or resist it? Will we embrace the dissolution that precedes reformation, or cling desperately to familiar forms even as they crumble? Will we die 1,000 small deaths in service of life, or die once, finally, never having truly lived?